In some corners of the internet, there is a term for stories that are intentionally, brutally distressing: eating glass. It describes that specific act of reading a story that is making you bleed all over, where the injustice is so sick it makes you want to throw your phone against the wall. You're in pain and yet you can't stop, you find yourself scrolling to the next chapter. We tell ourselves we hate it. We rant about it to our friends, but if we're being honest, the outrage is exactly why we're here. We aren't just reading these stories, we are feeding an appetite for the kind of pain that only fiction makes safe to consume. How about a story where a guy tries to drown himself and his little brother along with him, and then gets forced into sexual slavery to pay off his father's debts? Or about a pure, innocent girl's relationship with her liege, a man who has a lot of power over her, yet takes a sadistic pleasure in watching her cry and suffer? Or a story that depicts an actual sadist and his unfortunate victim. And oh yeah, they're all romance stories. Not because anything about them is remotely romantic, but because they depict the horrors of romantic relationships. And stories like this belong to a long tradition of outrageous romance with outrageous men. One of them, Lord of Scoundrels, follows a 19th century incel who hates all women and believes them to be inferior. It's almost impossible not to hate his guts, and not to feel outraged by his behavior. Eating glass is actually a Russian slang expression, one that I feel is missing from English, and it's used to describe reading stories that are morally or emotionally distressing, causing the reader a lot of pain. Well, the older word for these kinds of stories is tragedy, but reading tragedy feels respectable, whereas eating glass feels like a guilty pleasure. But in philosophy and literary studies, this phenomenon is known as the paradox of tragedy. It's a question that goes back to Aristotle and Augustine. How is that we can enjoy distressing fictional situations that we would never enjoy in real life? If we are not masochists or sadists, why do some of us seek out stories that are full of suffering? What is it about fiction that turns intensely unpleasant situations into situations we can enjoy? Or at least, bear? Why do we read stories that hurt us? It's almost as if we have an appetite for narratives that depict people in pain, stories that show torment that cannot be stopped. In each instance, the gruesome invites us to be either spectators or cowards, unable to look. A voice, presumably the artist, badgers the viewer. Can you bear to look at this? So why do we look? This video is made possible by the wonderful members of my Patreon. So how do we go about stories that depict situations of injustice and inequality? Because the natural response to them, and I confess it's often my response, at least initially, is outrage. Literary theory suggests that when we engage with a story, we often develop an empathetic response to what's happening to a character. We engage in a kind of mind reading, imagining how a character feels about what's happening to them. In other words, reading activates our empathy. So when you see a character suffer a horrific injustice, you're almost bound to suffer with them and to feel outraged on their behalf. So when I see how the protagonist of Low Tide and Twilight is repeatedly essayed, I can't help but feel that outrage, because it is outrageous. When I was reading it, I wanted to throw my phone against the wall. I kept wondering why I was still reading it if it made me so miserable. I ranted about it to my friends who, interestingly, agreed with my outrage, even though they liked the story. But that outbreak of outrage also felt almost cathartic. I don't think of myself as a very angry person, to be honest. I don't get angry that often in real life. But I rage all the time when reading about fictional characters, because some characters are just perfect hate objects. They feel so good to hate. Because you see, even so-called negative emotions can sometimes be enjoyable. But the key is control. John Morreall argues that we can experience negative emotions as pleasurable, but only if we have a certain degree of control over them, and experience them below a certain threshold. Having control means being able to pay attention when we want, to stop paying attention when we want, and to direct our attention to those features of the event that interest us. In real life, that's not really possible. We can't control the situations that anger or frighten us. If we could, we probably wouldn't be angry or frightened in the first place. But when we have the ability to start, stop, and direct the experience, we can enjoy a wide range of experiences, even unpleasant ones. That's why people sometimes seek out control of scary situations in real life, because because controlled fear can feel exhilarating. And fiction is a perfectly controlled space, so the things that can happen in fiction don't actually affect our lives. That's why fictional characters can feel so good to hate. I know they are not real and can't hurt me, and they haven't actually crossed any of my boundaries, which means I can enjoy my anger. And anger can feel good, almost like arousal, because it helps us express and assert ourselves and our values. As Morreall puts it, in anger we are telling whoever has offended us, and perhaps the whole world, who we are, what our rights and interests are, and what we expect, nay, demand from other people. This frustration and outrage can feel disturbing, but it also helps us define who we are. In real life, when we feel angry, it's usually because someone has violated our boundaries in a way that actually affects our lives. But fiction is a safe space where we can experience frightening or angering situations without real consequences, because the only thing being violated is our values and beliefs. That's why when I'm angry at a well-written outrageous fictional man, the kind that Salty writes, for example, I know I'm safe to be angry. In real life, anger is almost a locked emotion for me, but in fiction, especially when reading, I can often control my experience of outrage. We can usually control when such experiences take place and often have the power to walk away when they get to be too much, so the pain involved usually doesn't pass a certain toleration threshold. When we encounter frightening or angering situations through the safe space of fiction, we have enough distance to reflect on them. And it's not just because fiction isn't real, it's also because the author or the artist consciously plays with our emotional responses and regulates them for us, so that we feel safe enough to engage with the emotionally difficult parts of the story. Part of their job is to present the situation in a way that allows us to get satisfaction from the experience rather than being overwhelmed and utterly distressed by it. Sometimes they hint at familiar tropes or play along with readers' expectations to a certain degree. We usually trust the author. We expect that the suffering will make sense in the end, that it will lead to some kind of emotionally satisfying resolution. We expect the good guys to win, the bad guys to be punished, and the injustices to be somehow addressed. And when we read, we're constantly aware, at least on some level, of the formal features of the story. For example, we know the main character probably won't die, no matter what happens to them. We know these are fictional characters in a constructed narrative, and that awareness helps us regulate the distress we feel when we see them suffer. For example, I know my general expectations when it comes to romance novels. More than that, I know why outrageous men are in those stories in the first place. It is, of course, so that I can see them beg and grovel by the end of the book. It feels very satisfying. It also feels satisfying to see that the heroine is, metaphorically, always a fighter. She usually knows what to do about men who don't listen. So I have my expectations set. I know that in the end the horrible man will fall, and fall hard, and every single romance novel delivers on that promise. A smoking 45 and 6 corpses at his feet is a male fantasy. A woman will settle for one live hero at hers. And if she places a dainty foot upon his neck, it is only to invite him to kiss it. This is how we can enjoy our outrage, because we know it will lead to a satisfying resolution. Our understanding of the formal features of the story we're reading is what keeps us safe. The key, however, is subtlety. To feel both safe and emotionally engaged, we need to have some sense of the structure of the story, of how it all fits together. But those themes also have to remain mostly invisible, because once you become acutely aware of how the story is constructed, it stops being believable. Sometimes the formal features of a work become so obvious that we stop feeling distressed altogether, because in order to feel distress, we first have to be moved by the characters, and in order to be moved by them, we have to find the characters, their behavior, and the situations they face believable. In fact, what allows fiction to move us in the first place is not the objects it depicts, but the properties that make those objects seem metaphysically possible. We know that Dane and Jessica from Lord of Scoundrels don't actually exist. We know that they're fictional characters. What moves us is how believable we find their actions, their emotions, and the things that happen to them. For me, the bringing the asshole to heel trope only really works in historical romance. Only there do the situations where the heroine can simply walk away and has no choice but to bring a terrible man to heel feel believable. In Lord of Scoundrels, for example, Jessica can't just leave or choose another man, she has to beat some sense into this one and bring him to hell. And the way she does it feels believable enough and very satisfying. But if Jessica suddenly turned into a dragon, for example, we wouldn't find that metaphysically possible. It would be widely implausible in the context of 19th century England, a setting with no magic and no dragons. And because it would feel absurd, it wouldn't move us emotionally at all. Absurdity, however, can also be used consciously by authors when depicting distressing events. Some stories crank the cruelty up to such absurd levels that you almost can't help but detach from the violence, because it stops being believable. Hyesu Park, writing about the Korean Webtoon wave, analyzes a Webtoon called Dr. P series. It revolves around a superhero-looking physician, Dr. P, who treats his patients with methods that are absurd and deeply problematic. In the first episode, a man comes in with a toothache. The doctor breaks his leg so the leg pain will distract him from the toothache. Then he breaks the patient's spine so he wouldn't feel the excruciating leg pain anymore. The episode ends with the close-up of the patient's bloody, distorted face. This is obviously absurd, and intentionally so. In fact, in Korean there is a term Mukbang, meaning a dead end and nonsensical plot, used to describe dramas that push events and characters to extreme levels. Unknowingly falling in love with half-siblings, evil twins, amnesia, sudden comas, things like that. Sometimes fictional violence and tragedy are deliberately written as cliché so that we can enjoy the distance they create. This happens in BL comics all the time, with stories like Darkfall, where at some point you start thinking, okay, come on, no one can have this many misfortunes. And often as spectators, our main defense against horror is humor. That's why horror stories often include ridiculous or funny moments. It's also why the comment sections under particularly cruel webtoons often turn into competitions in wit. You almost have to joke about it to create distance, to shield yourself from the pain. We laugh so that we don't take it too much to heart. And we can laugh, because it's fiction, it's not real, that allows us to experience something frightening or cruel safely as spectators rather than participants. I think it would be impossible for someone like me to read a story like Sadistic Beauty Side Story B without detaching, because otherwise I would be utterly distressed. I even feel this weird urge to joke about it, even though the situation itself is objectively horrible. The story follows a guy, Minho, who is repeatedly raped, and my emotional response to it is honestly confusing. I obviously feel pity for him. I am distressed at his suffering. But at the same time, I know him from the main story as a shameless misogynist. There are a few characters that I feel as much contempt for as I do for Minho. So part of me thinks I should feel satisfied seeing him suffer, but I can't help feeling pity instead. And that leaves me in a very strange and emotional space. Honestly, I don't think I have the guts to finish that story. It's completely sick. And I even put it on the cover of one of my videos, and I can't stomach it. It's just too much. But that's just my response. Someone else might feel completely traumatized by it, or feel nothing at all. You've probably encountered this kind of reader, or maybe you are this kind of reader, the one who says, "You're distressed about this? I've read stories way worse. This is mild compared to something else." Because published fiction or comics are one thing, but anyone who's brave enough to dive into the dark waters of AO3 knows that people have all kinds of fantasies and all kinds of kinks. And I think that one of the strengths of fan communities is that many fans are able to accept that something is simply not their kink, rather than automatically labeling it as bad or wrong. They also recognize that one person's kink can easily be another person's trauma. Just because I find something distressing doesn't mean everyone else will, even when it's violent or cruel. Not only because of kinks, but also because every reader brings different life experiences and reading experience to the table. What seems believable to one person might feel absurd to another. What one reader sees as a tired cliché, another might see as a original or emotionally convincing idea. Take Low Tide and Violet, for example, that story where the protagonist is forced into sexual slavery. My main complaint was that I didn't find the character's behavior relatable or believable. I was particularly annoyed with Ihong. I couldn't understand why he gave up, and I didn't find Taejo's transformation convincing either. It made no sense to me that someone so cruel and unempathetic could suddenly realize he's an asshole. But Both of those things made sense to my friend, for whom this story is a favorite. She was able to relate to their relationship. To her, it felt like a realistic depiction of how abusive relationships actually work, minus the magic transformation, of course. Things that didn't make sense to me made perfect sense to her. I found myself getting really angry with the protagonist, for example, because to me, it felt like he wasn't angry enough. I wanted him to join me in my outrage and declare that what was happening to him was wrong and horrible. I needed him to be strong and badass in the face of all that injustice, so that I could feel emotionally safe while reading about it. The fact that he wasn't strong, the fact that, quite predictably, he eventually didn't have much fight left in him, made me incredibly distressed and uncomfortable. But the truth is, not all of us are strong or badass. Sure, it feels great to read about a heroine who makes the world burn, who makes bad men crawl at her feet. But not all of us are looking for a role model. We see role models all the time, just look at your Instagram feed. It's probably full of happy pictures of your beautiful friends who seem successful, confident, and put together in ways that make them look 20 steps ahead in life. Sometimes what we need are characters who are weak and human, who make outrageously bad decisions, and who simply don't have the strength to fight back. Characters who can't defeat villains and can barely get up from the floor. Characters who can only lie there and endure what's happening to them. People relate to Ihon, to his depression, to the way he is detached from his own life, to the way he barely seems to care what happens to him because they've been there. I haven't. I've been lucky enough not to experience that kind of despair. And that might be exactly why I'm so angry. I want him to fight the world. I'm even angry at the author. How dare she depict a character who doesn't fight back? The truth is that sometimes outrageous stories don't feel satisfying because the author deliberately removes all the safety devices we rely on as readers. Injustice is simply there. It doesn't always have a point, it often doesn't have a resolution, and that can be heartbreaking. Layla from Cry Or But I Get Back is the last person on earth anyone would want to be. She's an innocent girl tormented and repeatedly humiliated by the Duke who rules the land that she lives on. He does it because he feels humiliated by his own desire, because he wants someone so far beneath him. And Layla is almost completely powerless. She's an orphan living on his land, dependent on the very man who abuses her. She's also painfully human in that powerlessness. She's not badass. She can deliver clever comebacks. She's easily baited and she loses her composure all the time, and she can be cringy and almost pathetic in her sincerity and goodness. Reading her story is distressing because the source of her suffering isn't just the sadistic Duke, but the social and gender hierarchies that allow him to act this way. He hurts her simply because he can, and because he knows no one will stop him. And she is powerless, much like we feel powerless when confronted with our governments, our bosses, or any authority we can't challenge. Stories like this are extremely common in popular fiction aimed at women. They affirm the suffering of non-dominant people. They validate and console them. They legitimize qualities, ways of being, and entire lives that have otherwise been deemed puny or discarded. They create situations where those qualities can appear as luminous. These stories belong to what Lauren Berlant calls the intimate public sphere, a body of narratives circulating in media that are public in form, but experienced as deeply personal. All sorts of narratives that are read as autobiographies of collective experience. Layla, in the eyes of her society, is a loser. She's not only a woman, but a poor one. The Duke repeatedly tells her she is nothing. Yet we see her as admirable in her honesty and integrity. She is a good person. We don't think she is nothing, because we are her. This is her story, but in a lot of ways it's also our collective story. The story of our collective pain as powerless people. This is also why romance stories so often depict extreme injustice. Love becomes the ultimate soothing resolution, the perfect deus ex machina that can magically set things right. What do you do about a boss who bullies you simply because he can? Ideally, you quit. But what if you can't? What if there is no escape? Well, in fiction there is a different solution. What if the bully falls in love with you and stops being cruel? The abuser recognizes his wrongdoing, sometimes even before the victim fully realizes she has been wronged. In stories that belong to the intimate public sphere, the political becomes personal. Structural inequality, which in reality can only be challenged through collective action and slow political change, is instead resolved through individual transformation. In real life, there are no personal solutions to systemic problems, but for non-dominant people, however, doing politics often sounds like a threat. Because they struggle so much to make their own lives bearable, they often see political action as something that can re-traumatize them and destabilize the everyday lives that they fought for. Fantasy, in contrast, is a zone of stop-loss, a demand for the ongoing present to be the scene of lived fulfillment. In other words, fantasy asks for magical solutions to our pain. Which is why in fiction everything can be solved with love and feeling. And that is both satisfying and heartbreaking in its own way. Because you do know, right? That in real life, abusers don't magically stop being abusive. Love doesn't suddenly turn them into kind, self-reflective people. Still, even those magical resolutions, the sense of distance and control fiction provides, they aren't perfect coping mechanisms. Sometimes I still finish a story feeling angry and unsettled. And when that happens, I start directing those emotions outward, toward the real world. I want to blame someone. The author, for example. How dare she do this to me? How dare she write it like that? Then the next thought appears. Well, she shouldn't be writing magical solutions. How dare she write about an abusive relationship where the abuser gets better? Stories should be realistic. Ihyun should suffer for years and then die a miserable death. Stories about power abuse should be tragic because they are tragic and rarely have happy endings. Of course, we would never actually read stories like that. That sounds traumatizing. But somehow it would still satisfy us to know that all those stories that we never read are at least realistically gruesome. Then the anger shifts again to the readers. Don't they know this is tragic? I mean, I know, my friends know, every woman I've ever met knows that she would never want to be abused. But surely, people say, there must be some young and impressionable women out there who will treat any story with their romance tag as a tutorial for real relationships. Because it's always young women who are assumed to be gullible and impressionable. There's this persistent belief that women consume romantic fiction without any critical distance and then use it as a blueprint for real life. Partly because we live in a culture of victim blaming that insists women must be protected from their own possible bad choices. And partly because fiction aimed at women is often treated as purely pedagogical, as if its only function is to teach women how to behave. But, of course, the real function of those stories is to help us cope with the outrageous realities of structural inequality in a controlled environment of fiction. Whether or not coping is enough is another question entirely. Thank you for listening.